This is Podcast Theory.
Hello again, fellow podcaster, and welcome back to another installment of Podcast Theory Live. I am your host, Jason Sircone. It is Friday, July 16th, 2024. Before we get started, I want to take a quick second to apologize if you were expecting an episode yesterday, Thursday, July 11th. I apologize for not being here. I fully intended to be here with another episode for you, but unfortunately, Thursdays are a little unpredictable for me. I'm going to talk about that more at the end of the show, but I did want to say if you were waiting for an episode yesterday, I apologize that it did not happen. But we're back, and today we're going to press on with the return of a small series that I started when I was doing season 3 of this podcast. At the time, I had rebranded it as Solo Podcasting Simplified, and I had intended in turning this into a podcast fully dedicated to solo podcasting, but some things happened and I needed to pivot back to calling the show Podcast Theory. It was called Pod Theory before. I apologize if I am giving you a very confusing narrative, but the silver lining within that third season, which is great content, especially if you want to lean into solo podcasting, whether you want to do it solely as a solo show or you want to inject some solo content into your guest interviews. I love solo podcasting. As you can see, I'm doing this almost every day at this point here on Podcast Theory Live. But I also love the conversational side of it. Let's just say I love everything that podcast is bringing to me in regards to how I get to connect with you out there in the Bomb Squad. But during that little run of podcast content, I created a series that did gain some traction and was popular with the listenership of the show. It was called Podcast Therapy. And within Podcast Therapy, I was just taking a look at some things that could be helpful. Consider this a therapy session for your podcasting endeavors. As every episode is themed, I want to bring you good content that does help you become a better podcaster or think about things from a different perspective. So podcast therapy is really no different, but every Friday I figured, what the hell, let's have an official podcast therapy session once again. So if you have been clamoring for that content as a longtime listener and now viewer of Podcast Theory, we've got what you've been asking for. Today's therapy session, it's echoing a little bit about what I've been talking about throughout this week. You need to start podcasting for the right reasons. If you get into this for all of the wrong reasons, more than likely that motivation is going to catch up to you. And burnout is pretty much inevitable. So to encapsulate all of this, let me share my story in case you haven't heard it. I know I talked about it on an earlier episode this week, but when I first got into podcasting, and podcasting for me was an extension of the radio experience that I gained in college. Now, at the University of Pittsburgh at Bradford, this wasn't like some major radio station that I was a part of, but the communications program that I was a part of at UPB had a radio station on campus, and it was awesome because in that program, we were learning about the ins and outs of radio, of television, of communication as a whole, and radio was the piece of it that I really grabbed hold of. I had so much fun with it, and when I learned that you could practically be a radio DJ just by signing up, you didn't really have to have experience, you just got to learn on the fly how a radio station worked. I'm sorry, I have a hair in my mouth. That's really bugging me. So always good for the live environment to have a hair on your tongue. Nevertheless, when I signed up and got into it, I instantly felt like I was in place. I knew I had found something that I could really sink my teeth into. So I had a weekly show. When I think back on it, it was very much like a podcast because I would have some of my friends come in and they would co-host with me. I would have people from different sports teams and different organizations come up and I would do interviews with them, usually a little bit more short than what you would hear on a podcast, but also interwoven with that was the ability to play music. And the strength of the signal was not big. Of course, it got across campus and it stretched a few miles off campus. And one of the big feathers in my cap was it got to my mom's office. She worked for Zippo Manufacturing in Bradford, Pennsylvania. And when the radio show was on, she said everybody in the office turned it on and listened. So I always thought that was pretty cool. At least I was getting some exposure down at Zippo with all the folks making great lighters and all the things they do to bring a cool product to the world. So that was always the big feather in my cap. But more than that, just being on campus and having people say they listen to the show, that was all really great stuff. So when I was doing that, that was a big part of my life and I enjoyed it immensely. But I did not get the opportunity to pursue radio like I thought I might when college ended. And I took a number of different paths and a number of different turns. And fast forward 13 years later, I had not been on the microphone since, but podcasting was becoming more of this thing. Of course, there was the groundswell of podcasting was there. It was very prominent. Podcasting had been around for a good period of time at that point, but it was becoming more easy to get into. The initial podcasting steps that you had to take in order to get a show out there were a little bit more involved, but when RSS feeds entered the picture, it became much more approachable for the everyday content creator to start podcasting. So me and my friend Jason had started kicking around ideas, this podcast thing. It all started from a day of watching football where we were just talking about football and other things and just bullshitting like we normally would. And he said, this is a podcast. Why aren't we recording this? This is something that we should be doing. And I said, you know what? You're right. And that's where the idea really started, but we never could land on what we wanted the show to be or the type of things we wanted to talk about full time as we put that show together. And then it just so happened that I was working in the beer industry. It was more on the side. It was a side hustle at first. It did become my full-time thing after I lost my job, but I was doing a beer blog that had gained some traction, had a couple posts go viral, put me on the map here in Pittsburgh, if nowhere else. And then I took that experience and I parlayed that into building a mobile app that was designed to connect beer enthusiasts to events and happenings throughout Pittsburgh. And that's how I monetized, because I took that to the different bars and breweries and restaurants that I had written about and formed some partnerships, and things were starting to move in a great direction. And then when I launched the app, I had a troll look me up on Twitter to tear down everything I was doing. Now, looking back on it, he was fully allowed to have his opinion. But at that time, I think I probably took things way too personally. And I ended up engaging with this gentleman way too much. And we went back and forth for a while. And I looked to see what he did. I looked at his profile. Why does this guy get to have an opinion on what I'm doing with no context whatsoever other than I put this thing out today? Turns out he hosted a beer podcast. And that was all the motivation I needed. And I called my buddy and said, I've got our idea. We're going to do a beer podcast and we're going to do it better than this guy. And he said, all right, let's do it. And 2 weeks later, we had a podcast and our first episode went live. And it was a shit show. And it was a great introduction for me to get into the space, because I knew while we were recording that episode, all of those feelings that I felt when I got into radio in college came flooding back. So I knew I was in the right place. And I knew this was something that I really wanted to run with. I wanted to grab hold and not let go. And that was my motivation to get into podcasting. So on the surface, it seems like I did it for all the wrong reasons. And I think I really did. I think doing it out of spite was stupid. And I think anybody that if I would have said that out loud to anybody else in that time, other than my friend, they probably would have said, no, that's not how you should do this. Especially someone that had a podcast or a person that was in that field or that industry. They probably could have slowed me down and made me think about the long-term ramifications of what I was building, why I was building it, what I really wanted to accomplish, because it wasn't just to prove that I was better than this other guy, which I absolutely wasn't, because he had been doing it for a long time. He had way more experience than me. He was way better than I was. I knew I had to get better once I started. So getting into it was where the ball started rolling downhill, but it was a slow roll at first because I knew I had to take time to get better at my craft. I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have stuck to it for nearly 10 years as I sit and speak with you today, because I was not in any frame of mind thinking long term back then. There was just that competitive edge in me that wanted to prove that I could do this better than another person. That can drive you to a certain degree, but for the most part, that's not a good reason. That's not going to keep you invested in what you're trying to build. It's not a good reason to get something off the ground. I consider myself fortunate because it introduced me, and perhaps my brain is wired a little bit differently, and that allowed me to say, you know what, I found something big here. This got me back into something I enjoyed when I was in college, and now I have the ability to create content like this whenever I want to. And believe me, even as I continue to grow and develop within the space, I got to have a lot of awesome experiences through that podcast. But I knew even when we did close that podcast down, that I had a long way to go. And I needed to learn a lot more about myself as a podcaster, myself as a storyteller, myself as a communicator. And I knew I had found the vehicle that I wanted to leverage, but I needed to get better at it. The moral of the story is, if you're thinking about getting into podcasting, or you've recently jumped into podcasting, or you've been doing it for a long time, you have to think about your motivations. You have to think about your goals. Now, my goals are more than likely completely different than yours, and the person next to you, their goals are completely different than both of ours. That's completely fine. You are allowed to have your own goals for your content creation, and what you want your podcasting to bring into your world is completely up to you. But you still have to think about the long-term ramifications. And where there's a common denominator for all of us is that the fundamentals of podcasting and what we're trying to create and building a why, there is some parallels for every one of us. So if you're getting into it thinking that you're going to make $1 million after a few episodes, that's not a good reason to start. If you think that you're going to get into this because fame is going to instantly show up at your door, that's not a good reason to start. If you think that you're getting into this because you want to try to do a podcast better than somebody else, you may end up getting there at some point, because not everybody sticks to it. If you have that type of stick-to-itiveness attitude, maybe you will be able to surpass some other existing podcasts. But that's not the best reason to start a show, right? Think about what you're passionate about. Think about what your brand is doing to solve problems and bring people to a new level of transformation in their life. Podcasting is a vehicle that's going to add to all of the great things that you're already doing. It's a tremendous way for you to share stories, to make connections, to bring other people's perspectives onto your show via the guest circuit. If you're not thinking on that level, more than likely, your show is not going to get the momentum that you need to justify continuing pushing forward. Now, don't get me wrong. If you've got that type of commitment like me, you're going to push through everything. And believe me, we need more mindsets like that in podcasting. But I firmly believe that if you start for the right reasons, that's how that whole mindset gets developed. If you start for the wrong reasons, thinking that you're going to get rich right away, or you're going to be this famous person and you're going to become this VIP celebrity because you have a podcast, right out of the gates, that's not going to happen. And if that's your main motivation, when it doesn't happen, that could be enough to make you throw in the towel. Well, I'm not on the biggest shows in the world. No one knows who I am. I can't walk down the street. I can still walk down the street and no one knows who I am. I'm done. No, that's the wrong reason to do this. Those are the byproducts of producing great content and continuing to build on it over time. The more of an impact that you bring to the world, the more that content speaks to people, and that starts to put you on the map, because those people are sharing your content with others. That's how viral content is built. And I'm not really even speaking about virility here. I'm saying that you can't expect to gain all of this huge notoriety just because you press record. You have to earn the trust of your listeners. You have to really prove yourself to the marketplace, to your listenership, to your little corner of the podcast space, of your brand space. When you do that, good things will happen. That's why starting for all the right reasons is going to put you in a much better place. So if you're just getting started, or even if you've been doing your podcast for a while, take some time to evaluate where you are and why you're doing it. Now, if you're at the very beginning, this is a very easy thing to do, because these are questions that you're going to want to answer before you ever press record on your first episode. If you've developed a good why and you've thought about the power of the content that you're about to put together, you're going to set yourself up to succeed, and you're going to be a part of this for a much longer period of time. And believe me, that's the narrative I've been singing for a while here. We need more podcasters thinking like that so they get beyond 3 episodes. I think that all comes down to strategy. I mentioned that on an earlier episode this week. If you're not getting beyond 3 episodes, you're not even doing your planning right, because you need to be doing more episodes ahead of time to put yourself in a better position to succeed. Don't just do 1 episode and throw it out there. I did that. We kept building on it, but believe me, life catches up, because I remember me and Jason's first podcast. For the first maybe 7, 8, 9 episodes, we were okay every week. We were piss and vinegar, baby. We were getting together. We were doing these episodes. We were putting them out one at a time. There was no batch recording. It was just, let's see what's happening this week. Let's talk about it. Let's record it. Let's do very little editing, mistakes that we can cover at another time. And then we'll put it out to the world. Eventually, life caught up. And things, I can't get together this week. We're going to have to wait. Oh, you want to just do a solo episode this week? I can't make it. And then that was how the show started to come together, and not even really understanding the batch recording type of things. These are, again, mistakes that don't necessarily need to be analyzed right now. But the point is, you now have enough resources at your disposal. And if you're listening to this podcast, this is one of them that will teach you how to do this the right way, so you do put yourself in a better position to succeed. If you're thinking about starting for a silly reason, just take a moment to pause, put that on a projector and say, does this make sense? Is this something that I'm going to care about in the long term? Am I really going to have these feelings of spite for this long period of time that's going to motivate me to keep this podcast going? Probably not. Dig into why you really want to make a go at this, and why you want to make an impact on the world through the microphone and through the camera. And that is going to put you in a much better position to succeed. That is going to do it for today's return of Podcast Therapy here on Podcast Theory Live. A couple programming notes before I do bounce away for this weekend. First off, like I said at the beginning of the show, I apologize for not being here on Thursday. Thursdays are an unpredictable day for me. I'm part of a BNI group here in Pittsburgh, and yesterday I had a one-on-one session with one of my fellow members, and we ended up going to shoot pool and have a few beers, and that was how we decided to do our meeting, because she is a professional pool player, and I wanted to challenge myself to see if I could actually beat her. I'm proud to say, at least if she didn't let this happen, I beat her twice. That was fun, and we had a blast doing that, but it led to a longer time away from the computer than I was expecting, and I wasn't able to get back in time to do this. So apologies for that. I'm going to now going forward, do 4 days a week for Podcast Theory Live. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. Just because Thursdays are unpredictable, I don't want to say week over week, I'm going to be here, and then I'm not. Also, I did fiddle around with the live to tape feature that is offered through StreamYard. And I don't hate it, but what I don't like about it is the videos where I can add the intro theme and the exit theme, or the outro theme, were too big to upload. But then when you upload just your recording, it's got it's got like the weird gap at the beginning. So I don't hate it, because I can still bring you content, but I would much rather be here physically live, just in case someone does want to drop some comments and interact with me. So going forward for now, and this may change in the future, I'll of course let you know if it does, but I'll be with you Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Fridays. And of course, if there is something else going on in life where I have to say, look, I'm not going to be here, I will let you know in advance. Next week, here on Podcast Theory Live, also on Let's Blow This Up Live, and pretty much in my content creation world as a whole, I'm going to be talking about content repurposing in great detail. And the reason why I decided to do that next week, for one, I'm going to be joined by Lindsay Phillips on Let's Blow This Up Live next Wednesday. Lindsay is a content repurposing mastermind, and she helps podcast guests utilize their content to the fullest extent. So she's going to join me on Let's Blow This Up Live Wednesday at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube, on Facebook, and on LinkedIn. And you can connect to all of these at bombtrackmedia.com/live. Lindsay's going to share her insights. I am with her 100%, so I'm going to be adding in my thoughts. But throughout the week on each episode of Podcast Theory Live, I'm going to be sharing some different pointers, strategies, steps on how you can utilize each piece of repurposed content to your advantage. if you're not taking advantage of all of this great content that you have at your disposal from the podcast creation that you're in, you're leaving a lot of meat on the bone. And Lindsay's going to show you how to make the most of it. I'm going to back her up. And next week is going to be all about content repurposing. So strap in. It's going to be a hell of a time. So with that, I am going to wrap things up here on Podcast Theory Live for Friday, July 12th. I'm glad you were with me today. I will see you again next week as we get the ball rolling on Monday, July 15th, 2024. Until then, good talk, my friends. I will see you out there. Have a great weekend.